Okay, so we are now live and participants can now join.
Are we ready to go, Eric?
Yes, we are. Everyone's coming in now. So we'll maybe just wait a couple of minutes to let people.
Okay, just give me the word and I'll start.
For sure. Okay, we can begin.
Greetings wherever you are in the world this afternoon or this morning or this evening. It's a delight to welcome you to the fifth session of this year's International Law Weekend from the American branch of the International Law Association. This is the panel From Accord Back to Confrontation, the return of the Iran nuclear crisis, with an all-star lineup for a panel to discuss it with you today. And go through the merits of this proposal as briefly as we can, or this plan that is bringing us is back in the spotlight for not necessarily the best reasons. Anyway, I'd like to thank my panelists for coming here today and for all of you for joining us. I am Professor Beard at the University of Nebraska. I'm the chairman of the Use of Force Committee here at the American branch, also one of the American representatives to the International Law Association's committees. My prior service includes service in the Defense Department and arms control matters. And I would like to encourage you to ask questions. I'll be trying to review them and give them to the panelists, and as we leave some time at the end to discuss them. The attempt here is to have a more conversational panel with short presentations by each of the panelists, who I'll ask to give their best thinking on this plan and where it stands and where it's going and how we got here and whether it's a good deal or a bad deal even today. I'll be asking them to give their presentations. We'll have a little bit of interaction. I will with them and then with each other in the hope that we can have a more conversational experience here as we start wrapping up the panels for this year's International Law Weekend. I'd like to introduce the panelists briefly if I could. And the first to be speaking to us will be Professor Dan Joyner, the Elton B. Stevens Professor of Law and the Director of International Programs at the University of Alabama School of Law. He is the deputy chair of the Committee on the Use of Force here at the American branch, and also the author of the Oxford publication, Iran's Nuclear Program and International Law, From Confrontation to Accord, from which today's title is drawn. Go out and buy your copy while you can for Professor Joyner, all right? We all have to plug the work of our fellow scholars. So he'll be talking to you first, and I may ask him a few questions. And then I'll be turning to Dr. Sanam Vakil, the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa Program at the Chatham House. There, she leads the Future Dynamics of the Gulf Project and the Iran Forum. And she follows wider Middle Eastern issues as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And she is also the James Anderson Professorial Lecturer in the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the Johns Hopkins University, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Italy. And last but not least, Professor Matthew Koenig. Dr. Koenig is in the Department of Government and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, my beloved alma mater. There he is the director of the Global Strategy Initiative. Well, in that position, he is the director of the Global Strategy Initiative and deputy director of the Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Writes a bi-weekly column for foreign policy, and has served in several positions in both the Bush and Obama administrations in various strategy and strategic assessments positions. So our assessment today is of this plan and its success or failure, both as a legal document and as a political undertaking. And there is, of course, are possibilities amongst all of us that reasonable people will disagree about the efficacy, value, goodness, success of this plan. And I think no better person to start us down this path than a man who's invested quite a lot of his life in looking at it, diligently investing and exploring and writing and never making either side particularly happy, as he notes in the book. Professor Joyner, Dan, please take it from here.
I take that as a compliment. Thank you, Jack. It's good to be here with you, with all the panelists. I published the book you referred to in 2016, and it came, just on the heels. I was able to include in it the JCPOA and the related agreements and documents that per the title, I thought had brought accord to what had been a confrontation. In that book, I went through the Iran nuclear crisis that began in 2002 with the discovery of the Natanz and Iraq facilities, all the way up to 2015 and the agreement of the JCPOA. And I asked and analyzed legal questions about Iran's nuclear program along the way. I was highly laudatory of the JCPOA, and I still think that it was an immense achievement. I think that Kerry and Zarif should have won the Nobel Prize for it, in my own opinion. It's 159 pages, and in my mind, it rigorously and in detail gave each side what it needed to save face, go back to their constituents, and each claim victory, and yet have come to terms that ought to have solved the crisis over Iran's nuclear program indefinitely. That's my opinion. And after it was adopted, of course, Iran was in compliance all the way up through President Trump's 2018 announcement that the United States would withdraw. The stated reason for the withdrawal or the ceasing of participation by the United States was that the JCPOA did not address Iran's ballistic missile program or its malign activities in the region. Of course, neither of these were the purpose of the JCPOA. And had they been brought up as issues to negotiate at the time, there would be no deal. The JCPOA only addressed Iran's nuclear program, and to my mind, successfully, because it required Iran to ship most of its low-enriched uranium out of the country, required it to dramatically decrease its enrichment activity. It agreed to provisionally apply the IAEA additional protocol, and agreed to the destruction of the Iraq heavy water facility, and all of that so that it would have a much smaller amount of low enriched uranium with which it could, if it wanted, sprint for a bomb. And that was sort of the whole point from the US perspective. So my view of the JCPOA is that it was a great diplomatic achievement. And I think that the US withdrawal from it was unjustified and nonsensical. Maybe I'll end there to start with, because I know we're going to go on from there, but that's sort of my opening salvo of opinion. Jack, you're muted.
Of course, it falls to me to, probe this. I think you and I both agree that reasonable minds can disagree about disagreement. The proponents of it often say that, yeah, it wasn't a perfect deal, but it's the best we could get. It's not perfect, but this is the best we could get, and it's good. And that seems to me to be founded on a position, if you're in the business of arms control and trying to rely on some sort of document and undertaking as being really inherently dependent on a meaningful inspection regime. That there's no point in dealing with it when the response is, look, we stopped Iran's race to get the bomb. And that is the claim, that this represented this cessation, this halt. But the only way you can be sure of that you're getting the deal if you're the United States, is that there is actually a bona fide inspection regime, that you can see the contours of it, that you know all the details of the inspection, and that it covers all the facilities that might be at issue. And of course, the military facilities are not on the table. And there are all sorts of questions about exactly who does the inspections, and even worse, that parts of it aren't available to the parties to even see. What say you about the inspection regime on this, Dan?
Sure. It's the IAEA additional protocol regime. It's it's the best out there that they have agreed to participate in. I mean, we always have to remember that states are sovereign entities, and no state is ever, certainly the United States wouldn't, let international inspectors just roam around anywhere they want in the country, including military facilities. So the additional protocol, in theory applies to the whole country. But there are, and inspectors are supposed to get access to pretty much anywhere they want, although that access under the additional protocol is restricted sometimes to just environmental sampling or, visual check. You don't necessarily get to go into every facility. But again, that's the best inspection regime for nuclear programs in the world. It's sort of the highest standard. I don't really know what more. If you're speaking of reasonable minds, do we really think any country would allow more inspection and access than what the additional protocol allows for? I don't think so.
Yes. Well, I guess that's the problem with dumping the UN Security Council resolutions in exchange for this document, because of course, those UN Security Council resolutions were very explicit about the fact that Iran was putting all of these so-called civil nuclear facilities under military Revolutionary Guard control. That was always one of the objections. That, together with the fact that they kept on enriching, and that was a problem. And so we're left with this situation where the UN Security Council, of course, had that power to overcome national objections about this is our territory, this is our sovereignty. Those were intrusive. They were exchanged for this. And the argument could be that we lost a lot without those Security Council resolutions. But then the response is, yes, but we weren't getting anywhere. And so we'll pursue that some more, I think, with the other panelists as we come along here. I'm sure they both have great perspectives on, as does the audience out there. And I'll be reviewing your questions. So with that, and thank you, Professor Joyner. We'll be back. I can't help but read in your book. You were so thorough, and And you know, what I really appreciate in your book is that you noted that when Mr. al-Baradei was originally dealing with as an IA inspector with Iran, that he called the Iranians, he said, dealing with people who were willing to deceive to achieve their goals, and that we should not accept any attestation without physical verification. But of course, your argument would be there is the physical attestation now with this inspection, right?
As good as this reasonably can be done. Yeah.
All right. Let's go on to you, Doctor. Please, Sana.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a really complex topic, so I'm not sure I can do it justice in the short amount of time that you have afforded me, but I'll give it a go. And frankly speaking, it's not just about Iran, its nuclear ambitions. I think 4 years on and 2 years on from the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, it's abundantly clear that the Iran nuclear agreement is not just about Iran, the United States, and efforts to constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions, but frankly, very much connected to deep regional tensions, insecurities, perceptions among regional states of each other, also deeply connected to the role of the United States and its security interests and perceptions of regional states of the US commitment to the Middle East, deeply connected to geopolitical competition between Russia and China, as well as the United States in the region. And so a number of years on from the signing of a deal that was over a decade in the making, and as Dan rightly pointed out, is over 150 pages long, and was really celebrated as a monumental multilateral achievement after a long period of tensions and pressure on the Islamic Republic. Here we are in 2020 trying to contend with how to deal with Iran's reaccelerated nuclear program alongside all of the other issues that remain unresolved. Dan rightly pointed out that the Iran nuclear agreement, also known as the JCPOA, was a nuclear agreement. There was actually an option for this agreement to be a broader agreement. The Iranians put it on the table in the back channel that was facilitated between Iran and the United States. And the US said no. And the reason why the United States government said no is because they recognized that to create a broader agreement with the Islamic Republic would be very difficult. And it wouldn't meet the immediate security concerns of the United States, which would be to constrain Iran's nuclear program. And so we arrived at the JCPOA. Now, of course, we know that the Trump administration is seeking a bigger, broader deal, one that is broader in scope and scale vis-a-vis Iran. And 2.5 years on, let me just review a few turning points of the past year or two. There is no broader deal. There is no shift in Iran's regional engagement. It continues to support a number of militia groups and non-state actors, as well as states around the region. Its ballistic missile program remains ongoing, and its nuclear program that was constrained and under IAEA's inspection is no longer operating in the limited capacity as was agreed by the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. Last year, in reaction and in order to push back and to gain leverage vis-a-vis the sanctions-based maximum pressure policy, Iran began to push back. It began to breach its nuclear deal compliance, and it began to also exercise destabilizing leverage in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in the Straits of Hormuz, also allegedly, and I will say allegedly, being behind the attacks against Saudi Arabia's oil facilities of Abqeib and Khurais. Just to show you the consequence of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. 2.5 years on, no agreement, no regional stability, no control. Saudi Arabia has now moved forward on its nuclear program. Regional countries are sort of running free and sort of in absence of a more engaged American security presence in the Middle East, also pursuing their own bilateral and multilateral arrangements that are also destabilizing the region. We have ongoing conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. And it's sort of the Wild West in the Middle East, to put it in American terms, because I realize this sort of language works in my former home country. So where are we today? We're on the precipice of a US election. We have no nuclear deal. We have no regional stability in the Middle East. The US is distracted and disengaged. And there's an acceleration of tensions that is underway in the region. Obviously, much really hangs on the balance of November 3rd and the outcome of the US election. And I'm happy to discuss sort of those options going forward. But ultimately speaking, the JCPOA was important because it constrained Iran's nuclear ambitions, foremost. Secondly, it was important because Iran was complying in that agreement. Thirdly, it was important because it was a multilateral agreement with Europe, Russia, and China also supporting that agreement. And finally, I would just say it was also important because it was an agreement made between the United States and another country. The revocation of that agreement by the United States and the observation of the US's behavior vis-a-vis Iran has not only impacted Iranian domestic politics, which might not matter to the US electorate, because of the long-standing tensions. I will say that it matters also because this sort of activity and this lack of respect for an agreement has also been observed by other countries around the world, including many of America's partners and allies in the Middle East, that no longer have the sense of trust and faith in the commitment to such agreements. This might not be seen in the public pronouncements and the strength of the so-called partnerships of the United States in the Middle East, but rest assured, I can tell you from the many sort of private Chatham House conversations that we have, the sense of trust and confidence in the United States, particularly in the Middle East, is on the decline. And I would also add to that, in Europe, those same sentiments prevail. So the withdrawal from the agreement has caused profound instability in America's multilateral partnerships and in its security relationships and partnerships in the Middle East. I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks very much for that. You make a lot of great points. It's part of a much larger and complex Middle Eastern situation. Israel has its nuclear weapons. The neighbors are all looking at each other suspiciously. You're not suggesting, though, that this tension and problems weren't there even while Iran was a party to this document, though, right? It's been accelerated over this time, but Iran's activities throughout the Middle East have been steadily, the support you mentioned to foreign governments and non-state actors has been there and has been growing. You're saying this failure to go forward with this has exacerbated that? Is that the position?
Well, I would say that the US withdrawal from the JCPOA has had a number of consequences. First of all, obviously, Iran has responded in a very destabilizing way that has not resulted in new negotiations or the broader, bigger deal that the Trump administration has sought to bring to fruition. Secondly, of course, those drivers were still there, but there was an alternative approach. The approach would have been to keep the JCPOA where it was and actually engage with Iran and other regional states on managing regional security dynamics, which remain this serious elephant in the room to addressing US and geopolitical security concerns in the Middle East. That would have required addressing Iran's ballistic missile program, Iran's quote unquote, as you know, is part of the sort of non sequitur that comes after Iran's malign behavior in the region, but also everybody else's behavior in the region that now, as a result, has gotten also out of hand in the region. You have Iran as a malign regional actor, but everyone else has also become the malign regional actor that is happening. You've got Turkey being very adventurous in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Libya, in Syria, in northern Iraq, in Azerbaijan. And I can keep going with practically every other country in the region pursuing similar trends that are very destabilizing. I'm not saying that you need the United States to be present to assert control to manage these dynamics, but frankly speaking, in absence of a bit more assertive international engagement in the Middle East, regional competition has accelerated in a very aggressive way. And this is going to make the US objective of withdrawing from the Middle East, that is evidently clear from US presidential debates and from US goals to pivot and focus on China, really difficult, because you have a number of very hot conflicts in the Middle East, which are not limited to the nuclear program, but basically encompass everything from ballistic missiles to kinetic regional activity, everybody getting involved in multiple regional conflicts. So unpacking that is going to be an even greater challenge that is going to be falling on not just the United States, but other external actors to manage.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll come back to that point, some of your points there. You're right about Turkey's adventurism right now, and I don't think most Americans are following what's going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia right now, but it's really quite an enormous elevation and hostilities that have been relatively somewhat under control for many years. In any event, thank you for that, Dr. Vakil, and we'll be back to you. And now, because we do want to get your views on this, Dr. Koenig, and I look forward to it, and I'll discuss it with you as we go on. And thank you, panelists, for your succinctness and brevity and enthusiasm and so on. So please, Dr. Koenig, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Beard. It's a pleasure to be here speaking at this conference with my distinguished co-panelists, and thanks to the attendees for joining. I just want to say a little bit on my background on this issue. I did work on the Iran file in the intelligence community in the mid-2000s, and then in the 2010s worked on the Iran desk at the Pentagon in the Obama administration. In 2014, wrote a book on the Iranian nuclear challenge. And so I come out differently than my co-panelist on this. I think this was a bad deal. It was a mistake for the United States to sign up to it, and the Trump administration did the right thing by withdrawing. And a lot of complicated subject, a lot I could go into, but I think there's one key point I would want to get across, which is that there's a big difference between having a peaceful nuclear program, operating reactors for the production of energy, for the production of medical isotopes for medical purposes, a big difference between that and making the fuel for a nuclear reactor. Because once you can make the fuel for a nuclear reactor, you can also make the fuel for a nuclear weapon. And so making the fuel, uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing, is known as sensitive nuclear technology. And basically going back to the time of Eisenhower, the United States has tried to draw a line between those things and say, if countries want a peaceful nuclear program, if they want reactors, great, we'll even help them build them, with the Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. But they can't make the fuel, because once they make the fuel, it's too much of a proliferation risk. And so this is a policy we've imposed even on our allies. The vast majority of countries on Earth with truly peaceful programs don't enrich their own uranium. There's no reason for Iran to enrich uranium if it truly wants a peaceful nuclear program. And so South Korea is an example of a US ally that's asked to enrich and reprocess, and the United States has consistently said no. There's too much of a proliferation risk. United Arab Emirates in 2010 signed the so-called gold standard nuclear deal, where it promised never to enrich or reprocess. And that was always the goal with Iran. When it was announced that Iran was enriching in the early 2000s, the Bush administration response was immediate and automatic and consistent with the standard. It said that Iran needs to shut down its enrichment program. There were several UN Security Council resolutions, I think 8, I'd have to go back and count, that said Iran must suspend all enrichment activities. When President Obama was elected, he wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs saying he was going to stop Iran's enrichment program. And then basically we gave up. We decided it was too hard. And so we signed this deal that allowed Iran to keep a large enrichment program, 6,000 centrifuges. Moreover, the limits that were put in place on the enrichment program expired over time. After 10 and 15 years, all those limits expired. And so after 15 years, Iran would have been allowed to build as large an enrichment program as it wanted. Even President Obama acknowledged that once those limits expired, the time it would take Iran to build nuclear weapons, quote, shrinks almost down to zero. So this didn't even solve the problem. It didn't stop over the long run, wasn't going to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. And moreover, it set a bad precedent. I was in Seoul, South Korea shortly after the deal, and South Korean officials said, okay, well, if Iran can enrich, then we should be able to reprocess. If Iran, a US adversary, a country that your State Department says is the world's largest state sponsor of terror, can enrich uranium, then why can't we, a democratic country and ally, reprocess plutonium? And there was a double standard at the heart of US nonproliferation policy because of this deal. So I think it was a mistake to sign a deal that allowed Iran to enrich uranium. We should have stuck to zero enrichment as the goal of negotiations. And as was pointed out, it didn't address the other issues Iran poses. It wasn't meant to address those issues, but it did mean that it limited the United States' ability to push back on its ballistic missile program and in other areas because we were afraid of upsetting the deal. So I think with the Trump administration pulling out of the deal, we've now gotten rid of this double standard at the heart of our non-proliferation policy. The Trump administration says zero enrichment for Iran, no reprocessing for South Korea. We're back to trying to stop the spread of enrichment and reprocessing. And it's given us more tools to increase the pressure on Iran. And many people said, well, you're not going to be able to increase pressure if the United States goes it alone. But I think the US imposition of unilateral and secondary sanctions have been much more successful than many people expected. The Iranian economy is in real trouble. We've taken away resources that it was using to support terror groups and proxy groups throughout the region. And the goal was to force Iran back to the table, and it hasn't done that yet. And I think it's because Iran is waiting for the results of the election. They're expecting that they'll get a better deal with the Biden administration. And so we'll see what happens on November 3rd. But I do think that if Trump wins re-election, that Iran will have no choice but to come back to the table, because I think it's going to be very difficult for them to withstand this pressure for another 4 years. So in sum, I think it was a bad deal, and I think we need to get back to zero enrichment as the goal for Iran. So thank you.
Could I ask him a question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So Matthew, thank you for your intervention. I wanted to talk about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 4, which provides an inalienable right for all countries to have peaceful nuclear energy programs, as you know. It doesn't specify what parts of the fuel cycle a country can have, nor does it limit the parts of the fuel cycle a country can have as part of its inalienable right. But I suppose what I would ask you is, if Iran has a right to a peaceful nuclear program, then do you think it would be reasonable or realistic to expect them to depend on foreign sourcing of nuclear fuel when it has such antipathy towards it from so many states? Where would you think they're going to order from Urenco, like Western European states? I think that Iran's view on that would be that they need a dependable source for nuclear fuel so that they can have their Article 4 right to a peaceful nuclear energy program, and that the only dependable source of fuel is to make it yourself. And they're not the only country, as you know, that does not want to accept the US gold standard. Saudi Arabia doesn't want to, Jordan doesn't want to. And it's for these reasons, because of the feeling that there is a right in international law to a peaceful nuclear energy program, and the country doesn't want to be dependent on outside sourcing of fuel. So let me, if you wouldn't mind responding to that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Article 4 of the NP. So the short answer is yes. I think Iran should, if it truly wants a peaceful program, could depend on international markets. But let me unpack that a little bit. So you're absolutely right that Article 4 says that countries have a inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology. So what is peaceful nuclear technology? What is an inalienable right? The NPT doesn't spell that out. So as you know better than me, this is one of the problems with international law. There's ambiguity, and so states are the highest sovereign authority, and so they interpret this in different ways. So Iran says this means we can enrich. The U.S. interpretation is, or at least the one interpretation is no, that this is too close to a weapons program. Enrichment and reprocessing is not part of the inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology. So then I think the second thing I'd like to say is that Iran doesn't want a peaceful nuclear program. It's pretty clear if you look at the contextual information that this is, or at least was, a cover for a bomb program. And this, the desire to keep open the nuclear weapons option remains an Iranian goal. And I detail in my book, there are about 8 different things that Iran's doing that makes absolutely no sense for a truly peaceful program, only makes sense for a weapons program. So there's no reason for them to have a heavy water reactor like they're building at Iraq. That's just a plutonium producing machine. If they really wanted energy, they could have a light water reactor. There's no reason for them to develop ICBMs if they don't want nuclear weapons. No country on earth, not even the United States, puts conventional warheads on ICBMs. The only purpose is to deliver nuclear weapons. They wouldn't be working on nuclear weapons design, as the IAEA caught them working on, if they're only interested in peaceful programs. So it's clear that Iran wants nuclear weapons, so we shouldn't allow them to have this cover that this is really a peaceful program. And then if it's really a peaceful program, we've offered them all kinds of options. The Russians have said they provide fuel. We've talked about fuel banks, and Iran has said, no, we want to enrich uranium ourselves. And so, yeah, they're cover stories. They don't trust the international community, but the real reason is they want to be able to make fuel, so they have the option of making weapons. On the gold standard, there are kind of 3 levels here. The gold standard is the best. It's what UAE signed up to. They said, we will never enrich or reprocess. And you mentioned Jordan and Saudi Arabia, but that's a different category. Yes, they haven't been willing to sign up to the gold standard, but they also have no intention to enrich or reprocess, no enrichment or reprocessing program. The United States has made it clear that we would oppose enrichment or reprocessing. And then you have Iran that is enriching uranium. So again, I think if Iran wants a peaceful program, then we're happy to give it that. That's not what it's trying to do here.
I'd add that focus on enrichment, of course, was the linchpin of those Security Council resolutions, as the Security Council kept on condemning it and ordering it not to continue. And now with this open acceptance of them enriching, there is now pretty much no standard for our allies. I'd note Japan continues to reprocess and build this massive supply of plutonium that is supposed to be able to be used for reactors that they don't fit in yet. This is not helping non-proliferation, I think, from the perspective of the allies that we have that we'd like to contain. But that's all subject to debate. Do you have, I guess I'd go back to you, Dr. Vakil, for a moment. Looking at the larger Middle East situation here in this, and I want Dr. Koenig to speak on this too. The situation we're facing now is turbulent at the least, and you've spelled out the reasons why there's so much tension. Do you dismiss as just propaganda or nonsense or something a recognition here by Sudan, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates of Israel? Is this showing any sign of any progress or just propaganda or something like that?
Thank you. Interesting question. I wouldn't say it's propaganda. I'm not trying to be dismissive. Please don't take my comments to be that in any way. The Abraham Accords, of course, suggest regional shifts that are underway. I wouldn't say those shifts are underway because of the Trump administration, but in reaction to the Trump administration, that has been nothing but inconsistent over the past 4 years about its commitments to the Middle East, about its commitments to its partnerships in the Middle East, including to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Many of these countries, of course, have very strong relationships with the Trump administration, but have been very anxious and worried about the current and future commitment of the US and the security partnership that has long guided these relationships, with the US not taking a strong response to Iranian provocational behavior in the summer of 2019, from the downing of the US drone to the attacks on Saudi oil facilities. This raised a lot of questions and anxieties in the Gulf states. So I see the Abraham Accords as an opportunity for some of these countries to try and define and address their own security interests in absence of security from the United States. And what better way for the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in particular, and obviously Sudan and others, to do so by taking a step forward, recognizing their relationships that have long been underway with Israel, and taking a more proactive role to define their security interests in the Middle East without the United States, which appears to be a consistent US foreign policy direction that has been underway since the Obama administration, not just unique to the Trump administration, and seems to be a consistent theme going forward, regardless of the outcome of November 3rd. Obviously, if President Trump wins, we expect more recognition and normalization trends to emerge, and that in itself could be interesting in terms of regional alignments. But if he doesn't win, that also the outcome will see perhaps greater momentum to multilateral U.S. engagement in the Middle East, and that will alter the contours of regional relations, not just with the United States, but with regional states among themselves. Ultimately, many Middle Eastern states have used the role of the U.S. in the region as a protective cover to prevent direct regional relationships. And my sort of reading of regional dynamics is that there is no regional security process that allows regional states to address their security issues. So the constant turn to the United States to do that for them is a lot of the driver of these conflicts and dynamics. The US engagement on the Iranian nuclear program should not just be about Iran's nuclear program, but broader regional nuclear programs that are not just limited to Iran, but of course include Saudi Arabia, the UAE's gold standard, Egypt, Jordan, and the like, and trying to negotiate regional solutions would lower the security temperature writ large throughout the region.
Okay, you're talking correctly about the future, and which is one of the items we've listed as one of the things we're focusing on here. So, and you started us on that path. Do I assume, Professor Joyner, that if there were a change in administrations, you would want to pursue some sort of revival of this document, which is not an agreement, never has been an agreement, never was processed as a treaty or a legally binding document, but nonetheless, you would go back to the Security Council and see it put back in place, as opposed to Dr. Koenig's comments about the sanctions, their efficacy, the declining Iranian economy, and so forth. Would that be what you would propose if we did have a change in administration?
Absolutely. I think the US should just come back into compliance with the JCPOA. I don't think you need to do anything in the Security Council. All other members of the Security Council, I think maybe.
The Dominican Republic is the.
Yeah,
country
that's the one. Does not accept that the United States triggered and implemented the snapback. So I don't think you have to do anything in the Security Council. The US should just come back into compliance with the JCPOA and work with our allies in Europe to hopefully convince Iran to come back into compliance. I think that that with the JCPOA in place, with the limits that were imposed on Iran's program, there was far less tension between Iran and the United States, Europe, and it certainly was no panacea for Iran's role in the region, but it stopped the tension about its nuclear program. And if there is anything that can be done to reduce tension between Iran and its neighbors and the United States, I think that's a good thing.
As long as nuclear weapons aren't being built.
Yeah, you could say that about, yes. I've never denied that Iran, just like the CIA said, had a nuclear weapons research and development program. Absolutely. That, as the CIA said, primarily stopped around 2003. We know from the cache of documents stolen in the night by the Mossad that some more about the scope of the nuclear weapons R&D program. But there's just no reason, I think, that I have been convinced of, to think that Iran is going to make some mad rush for a nuclear weapon. I think that the R&D program at the time was more inspired by the war with Iraq in the 1980s than anything else, to have a defensive capability. I don't think there's any reason to think that if they had a peaceful nuclear program, that it would at some point in the future be used to cover a nuclear weapons program. Could it? Sure. So could Japan. You mentioned Japan and it's reprocessed tons of plutonium. Does anyone not think Japan could make a nuclear weapon if they wanted to?
China certainly does.
Yeah.
China complains bitterly about Japan's.
Any non-nuclear weapon state that has a peaceful nuclear program could build a nuclear weapon. That's true.
Well, let me finish up our look at the future here, and turn to you, Dr. Koenig, and then I'll give you a couple of audience questions. But what about the future as it now plays out with U.S. sanctions or some other alternate model in the future? What's your best view of the future or the way forward?
Yeah, well, I think we will see two very different outcomes, or two different futures depending on who wins the election. I know Trump administration officials have said that after China, Iran is going to be their foremost priority in the second term. And the reason is that they think they're making progress and they have a prospect of success after the election. Again, they think that Iran is waiting out the election, but that if Trump wins a second term, they would need to negotiate. And so I think it would be a continuation of this maximum pressure campaign to try to force Iran to come to the table and negotiate more stringent limits. If Biden wins, he said he would return into compliance with the deal if Iran were willing to return the favor. Now, one challenge with that, though, is the sunsets of the original deal. The arms embargo has already expired, and so Iran can now buy advanced conventional weapons from Russia, China, and others. Excuse me, I have children in the background. And in just 5 years, then the limits on Iran's, according to the original JCPOA, the limits on Iran's enrichment program begin to expire. And so some of Biden's advisors have said, well, we would return into compliance, but we would have to start renegotiating amendments because these original sunsets are just too short. We need to get longer timeline on that. I just want to say would Iran build nuclear weapons? If Iran doesn't want to build nuclear weapons, then why did it fight so hard for every last centrifuge in these negotiations? Why did it fight so hard to get the limits the sunsets. I mean, if Iran wanted to solve this problem, it could say, okay, we'll shut down the enrichment program. Or if they wanted to solve this, they could say, okay, these limits on the enrichment program will be forever. But they negotiated tooth and nail over every last centrifuge. And I think the only plausible explanation is they want to keep the nuclear weapons option open. There are two ways they can get there. One is they just wait for the limits of this deal to expire, and then they can build as big a program as they want, so essentially that their breakout time is zero, and they could have enough material as soon as possible. And then the other one is well, I think, not now that there are no limits, they are inching towards a program. So I don't think they're going to make a mad dash to a weapon, but as they build more enrichment facilities, bring online more centrifuges, more advanced centrifuges, stockpile higher levels of low enriched uranium, that breakout time shrinks down so low that the rest of the world at some point will be in a position where we can't stop them, even if we wanted to.
Thank you for that. Let me turn to a couple of audience questions. One, which I think we primarily addressed to you, Dr. Vakil, concerns the establishment of a non-nuclear weapons zone or nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. From my work in the Middle East, with especially through the Persian Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, I think any prospect of that is going to be very dependent on your view of Israel and why the many states there justifiably are unwilling to join that without Israel coming in too. Anyway, that's the question to you about whether or not a nuclear-free zone is a viable option for the Middle East.
Professor Beard, I share your skepticism. I mean, I think in theory it's a good idea, and a lot of states, including Iran, pay lip service to this idea of this nuclear weapons-free zone. But in reality, we're quite far away from that being a prospect. Not just because of Israel, which remains, obviously the big elephant in the room, but also because it's very clear with Iran's nuclear program and the JCPOA being unmanaged and unconstrained right now, that other countries' nuclear programs, in particular, I would say Saudi Arabia's, are accelerating and accelerating at a level that is also concerning for the Trump administration. So to think that we can go back to the possibility of a nuclear-free zone, I think we've passed that point. So ideally, finding a regional-wide constraint for everybody's program is got to be the new gold standard, and sadly, it's probably not going to be the UAE's gold standard. I think a point about all of these agreements that often comes up is that they're compromises, they're not concessions. And that's something that oftentimes people miss in thinking about how the JCPOA was arrived at. Not everybody got their maximalist position, including Iran and including all of the players at the table. So in thinking about what is attainable in the Middle East, we have to think about we have to move from the zero sum to sort of the gray space where everyone is willing to give a bit of ground. And in these sort of public discussions, and even in the private discussions, you don't quite hear what the ground that people are willing to compromise will be. But that's really what we should be talking about and thinking about in order to have productive discussions moving forward.
Thanks very much. The discussion here about the future being on one hand, continued U.S. sanctions and trying to force the Iranians back to the table generates a question here from one of the viewers that we are now seeing many ostracized regimes like Iran's and Maduro's Venezuela align and support each other in the face of economic and political pressure, especially from the U.S. to bear these measures. How can the U.S. and its allies face this? As an example, Cuba endured the embargo and still does for many years with this strategy with the help of the USSR, now with its alliance with Venezuela. So if we do continue down this path, with increased tension, some of the panelists speak here and address, in the face of more American sanctions, which can be evaded, at least to some extent. What say you about the future of an enforcement regime based on, it will always be less effective than a unified approach that could have been possible had there been a UN Security Council consensus. There's not that. And so it's going to be handicapped significantly that way. But I guess, Dr. Koenig, you spoke about the effectiveness of US sanctions that may be overlooked. I guess I'll start with you, and then any views from you, Dr. Joyner, and Dr. Vakil, if you have any views about it. Thank you. Go for it.
I guess I think this is really consistent with US grand strategy over the past 75 years. We've kind of created this, with our allies, this rules-based international system, and it's pretty simple grand strategy, kind of create this system. Maybe I'm talking, you need to give me some time. My 3-year-old here, sorry. Created this.
Mine are just a little bigger, but they still talk too.
Yeah. Joys and pitfalls of working at home. But we create this system, promote democracy, work through international institutions, open markets, and say if countries want to join the system and play by the rules, welcome. Even former allies or adversaries like Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, you want to play by the system, great. But for those autocratic revisionist countries that are trying to challenge the system, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela today, we're going to defend ourselves, and we're going to pressure you. And so, yeah, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela working together. Yeah, I think so. They're not benefiting from the system. They're trying to challenge it. But the system has worked really well for the United States and its allies, and really for most of the rest of the world over the past 75 years. And so, I think these countries are in a weak position. United States and formal treaty allies is roughly 60% of global GDP. Comparatively, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, these are small countries. So I do think this is one downside of the way the Iran nuclear deal was handled. Signing the agreement and then pulling out, I think, isolated the United States more than it needed to be. My preferred solution would have been never to sign the agreement in the first place, to stick to our principles. But nevertheless, I think fine, Iran and Venezuela are going to cooperate and try to resist the sanctions. Fine, I think they're going to come out on the losing end of this.
So, Professor Joyner, you noted how the United States kind of did it. Well, you suggested the United States did itself in at the Security Council. Had it remained a formal participant, it could have then appropriately invoked the snapback provisions. The snapback provisions were held up by the Obama administration as the ultimate safeguard. And they're turning out not to be that. They're not achieving what the United States had been promised at all. But you might attribute that to the way the Trump administration terminated its involvement in it and called itself essentially a non-participant, so it couldn't invoke participant rights. That's the continued discussion of the snapback provision probably isn't too interesting to the audience, but you make you hinted at that point earlier when you spoke. So what about the future for you and Dr. Vakil here? Closing comments here for the panel.
Sure. I would say no one has done more to destroy the liberal rules-based order than the current president of the United States. And I think the United States is going to have to come to terms with what's really happening in the world and our diminishing ability to enforce our will on other countries. I think that the return of great power rivalry with Russia and China is going to give states like Iran choices. And I think they are making choices. They are turning to the East and, sort of forming alliances with Russia and China that can sustain them. And that will further decrease US ability to bring maximum pressure on them. So if we want to have any accord with Iran about its nuclear program, we have to accept things as they are. We have to accept that they have demands and we cannot be maximalist about it. There are reasons to have a full nuclear fuel cycle, independence, national pride. It is not the case that every country that has a full nuclear fuel cycle wants a nuclear weapon. That's just not the case. Perhaps there are many countries that I do think have a nuclear fuel cycle, and one reason may be that they have the capacity, if they want, to make a nuclear weapon, but I don't think that's unique to Iran. So again, I am in favor of the U.S. rejoining the JCPOA and trying to work with our allies to reduce the threat of Iran's getting a nuclear weapon. But I think we have to be realistic about it and how much pressure we can bring to bear.
Sadly, our time has expired here together, panelists. Thank you, Dr. Vakil. Thank you, Professor Joyner. Thank you, Dr. Koenig, for your assistance today. Thank you, attendees out there. There's networking opportunities available to you after this session, which you're invited to. If you can check the program and chat and network with people in areas of similar interest of yours, led by the different committees of the American branch. It really is a delight to see you all here, my fellow panelists. You're looking great. We got to meet some of Dr. Koenig's family here briefly as well. So, and Professor Joyner there is at a vacation place.
That's right.
And has found what corner he can to speak. And thank you especially, Dr. Vakil, for joining us later on, much later on in your workday there in the United Kingdom. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, and see you at next year's International Law Weekend.
Thank
Good
you all.
evening. Bye-bye.